Blue lights fill your mirror, a siren gets louder behind you, and in that split second, most drivers make exactly the wrong move, one that can genuinely cost them £100 and points on their license, even though all they were trying to do was help. Let's break down exactly what the law actually requires when an emergency vehicle approaches, where the real fines are hiding, and why good intentions won't save you from a penalty if the maneuver itself was illegal. Before we get into it, I want to flag something honestly because a lot of coverage on this topic uses dramatic language, suggesting there's some brand new, formally named rule just landed for this year specifically, and it's worth being upfront about that before going any further. There isn't a distinct new law called an emergency vehicle corridor sitting in UK legislation. What we're actually talking about is Rule 219 of the Highway Code, the rule governing exactly how you're supposed to behave when an emergency vehicle approaches, and it's genuinely one of the most misunderstood rules on the entire road, precisely because most drivers have never actually read the wording properly. They've just absorbed a vague sense of, "get out of the way," from years of driving without ever checking what the rule technically requires. Here's the wording itself, because it matters more than the summary version most people carry around in their heads. You should look and listen for ambulances, fire engines, police, doctors, or other emergency vehicles using flashing blue, red, or green lights and sirens, or flashing headlights, or highways agency traffic officer and incident support vehicles using flashing amber lights. When one approaches, do not panic. Consider the route of the vehicle and take appropriate action to let it pass, while complying with all traffic signs. If necessary, pull to the side of the road and stop, but try to avoid stopping before the brow of a hill, a bend, or a narrow section of road. Do not endanger yourself, other road users, or pedestrians, and avoid mounting the curb. Do not brake harshly on approach to a junction or roundabout, because a following vehicle may not have the same view as you. Read that carefully, and one phrase does an enormous amount of work, while complying with all traffic signs. That's the entire crux of why so many well-meaning drivers end up fined. There is no legal exemption anywhere in the Highway Code, or in wider traffic law, that permits you to break a traffic rule specifically because you're trying to make way for an emergency vehicle. The obligation to give way and the obligation to obey every other traffic law both apply simultaneously. And if those two things genuinely conflict in the moment, the traffic law wins, not your instinct to help. Let's go through exactly where this catches people, starting with the single most common mistake, jumping a red light. You're stopped at a junction, an ambulance is closing in behind you with lights and sirens going, and the instinct is to edge forward through the red to clear space. Do that, even at walking pace, even with the clearest possible reasoning, and you've committed the same offense as anyone else running a red light. The penalty is a £100 fixed penalty notice and 3 points on your license, and if it escalates to court rather than being dealt with as a fixed penalty, that figure can climb considerably higher. Red light cameras don't record audio, they simply capture a vehicle crossing the stop line while the light is red, so the footage used against you shows nothing about the siren you could clearly hear, only the fact that you crossed the line. The correct approach at a red light is almost uncomfortably simple, and it's exactly the opposite of what instinct tells most drivers to do. Stay exactly where you are if moving forward means crossing on red. Emergency vehicle drivers are specifically trained to navigate around queued traffic at junctions, and they genuinely expect civilian drivers to hold their position rather than attempt to create space illegally. If the lights change to green while the emergency vehicle is still approaching, and moving off safely and legally creates room, take that opportunity. But holding still and legal beats moving and illegal every single time, regardless of how much pressure you feel in the moment. Yellow box junctions catch out a similar number of drivers, and the mechanics are just as unforgiving. Stopping inside a box junction to let an emergency vehicle through feels logical in the moment, clearing the road ahead so the ambulance has somewhere to go. But box junctions exist specifically to prevent exactly that, vehicles blocking an intersection, and the camera enforcing it records your position inside the box, not your reason for being there. Penalties here run up to £130 outside London, rising as high as £160 on London's red routes specifically. There's no field on the penalty notice for explaining you were trying to help an ambulance. The camera simply sees a vehicle stationary inside a yellow box. Bus lanes are the third major trap, and this one has a genuine nuance worth understanding properly. If a bus lane is currently open to general traffic at that specific time of day, Pulling into it briefly to create space is legal because you're simply using a lane you're already permitted to use. But if the bus lane is active and restricted at that moment, swerving into it to let an emergency vehicle pass is exactly the same offense as using it for any other reason, with penalties typically ranging from 60 to 130 pounds, depending on the local authority enforcing that specific stretch of road. Checking the operating hours on the sign before you move, even in the middle of reacting to an approaching siren, is the difference between a legal maneuver and an automatic camera fine. Here's something genuinely important if you do end up with a penalty despite everything going through your mind being about helping an emergency vehicle get through. The context does not automatically cancel the fine. You can absolutely appeal, and if you have dashcam footage showing the emergency vehicle's lights and sirens at the time, that's worth submitting as part of your case, because some authorities do exercise discretion once the full picture is understood. But it's an appeal you have to actively make, not an automatic exemption baked into the system. And each case genuinely is assessed individually, rather than there being a blanket rule that emergency vehicle context wins automatically. There's a broader principle buried in all of this that's worth remembering the next time you're caught off guard by an approaching siren, because it genuinely simplifies the entire decision in the moment. Act as you would if no emergency vehicle were present at all, but take any legal, safe opportunity available to create space. That single sentence resolves almost every situation you'll actually encounter. If moving forward requires breaking a rule, don't move forward. If there's a genuinely safe and legal gap, use it. The emergency vehicle changes your awareness and your urgency. It does not change what's legally available to you as a driver. It's worth knowing which vehicles this obligation actually covers, too, because it's broader than just the ones with sirens blaring. Police cars and motorcycles, ambulances, rapid response paramedic vehicles, fire engines, and blood bikes. The volunteer motorcyclists who transport urgent medical supplies using green lights all fall under this same rule. Highways England vehicles operating on motorways typically use amber lights rather than blue, and while the obligation to give them space still applies, the same rule about complying with traffic signs remains equally binding, regardless of which colored light is flashing at you. There's also a common misconception worth clearing up about what happens if an emergency vehicle finds itself genuinely stuck in stationary traffic with no way through at all. When that happens, drivers commonly switch off their sirens and lights and simply wait for a green light or another legitimate opportunity to move, rather than expecting queued traffic to somehow part illegally. If you're sitting in traffic and notice an emergency vehicle's lights and sirens suddenly go quiet behind you, that's often exactly what's happening. The crew making a judgment call that waiting safely is the better option than pressuring drivers into illegal maneuvers around them. Motorways add their own specific complications worth understanding separately, because the standard pull to the side advice doesn't always translate cleanly at higher speeds and multiple lanes. If you're on a motorway and become aware of an emergency vehicle approaching from behind, the safe approach is to check your mirrors early, signal your intentions clearly, and move toward the nearest lane that creates a path, generally moving left where it's safe to do so, well before the vehicle is right on top of you, rather than making a sudden lane change at the last moment. Sudden, late maneuvers on a motorway create far more danger than a slightly delayed response, and emergency vehicle drivers on motorways are specifically trained to filter through gaps between lanes at reduced speed precisely because they expect traffic to shift gradually and predictably, rather than instantly. Roundabouts deserve their own mention too, because the geometry genuinely changes what getting out of the way should look like. Stopping abruptly on a roundabout to let an emergency vehicle through can be more dangerous than simply continuing around to the nearest safe exit and pulling over immediately afterward. The guidance specifically warns against harsh braking on the approach to a roundabout, precisely because a vehicle behind you may not have the same visibility of the emergency vehicle that you do, and a sudden stop in that situation risks causing exactly the kind of secondary collision the whole rule is designed to prevent in the first place. So let's bring this together into something you can actually use the next time blue lights appear in your mirror. Stay in position at a red light rather than edging through it, because emergency drivers are trained to navigate around you, not expecting you to break the rule for them. Never stop inside a yellow box junction to create space. The camera doesn't record your reasoning, only your position. Only use a bus lane if it's genuinely open to general traffic at that specific time. Checking the sign takes seconds and matters enormously. On a motorway, move gradually and early rather than making a sudden late lane change, And on a roundabout, continue to your nearest safe exit rather than braking harshly, where a following driver may not see what you see. If you do receive a penalty in a genuine emergency vehicle situation, appeal it with dashcam evidence if you have it, rather than assuming it stands unchallenged. And above everything else, remember the core principle. Drive as you normally would, legally, and simply take whatever safe, legal opportunity presents itself to let the vehicle through. None of this is designed to make you hesitant or overly cautious the next time you hear a siren. Emergency vehicle drivers are genuinely well-trained specifically to work around ordinary traffic behaving normally and legally. That's the entire basis of their training. The drivers who end up fined are almost always the ones who panicked and assumed helping meant breaking a rule, when in reality, the safest and most legally sound response was simply to hold position and let the professionals navigate around you. It's worth understanding why the rule is written this way in the first place, because it isn't bureaucratic indifference to the emergency being responded to, it's the opposite. Emergency service driver training specifically accounts for ordinary, predictable, rule-following traffic, because that's what allows them to move through it safely at speed. An unpredictable driver who suddenly breaks a rule to help is actually harder and more dangerous for an emergency vehicle to navigate around than a queue of traffic behaving exactly as expected. Ambulance and fire service driving instructors have spoken publicly about this exact point, that a driver holding a legal, predictable position is consistently easier and safer to work around than one making a sudden, well-intentioned but erratic maneuver. What feels like unhelpful passivity from inside your car is often, from the emergency vehicle's perspective, exactly the behavior that lets them get through fastest and most safely. If this cleared up exactly what Rule 219 actually requires and where the real financial risk sits, hit subscribe, because understanding rules like this properly is exactly what keeps you safe and your license clean. Rules that feel like common sense are often the ones drivers misjudge most, precisely because nobody stops to actually read the wording until the moment they're already reacting to a siren in the mirror. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.